I gotta admit, it has been some time without any FIA nonsense overshadowing a race, and we finally had that this weekend in Austria. However, this time it may not have been entirely their fault, and surprisingly they may have acted accordingly, so for the first time in a while it's not all on them. While some drivers were hit the hardest with time penalties given hours after the race, others have not gotten a single one, which begs the question, was this weekend's chaotic post-race really on the FIA or on the drivers? Join us as we delve deeper into why Red Bull Ring's turns 9 and 10 were such a monumental task for some drivers in each lap, and whether or not the FIA did the right thing with the 5-hour delayed penalties. Indeed, the Austrian Grand Prix was notable not only for Verstappen's supremacy, but also for the numerous penalties imposed against a bunch of drivers for violating track limits, as per Article 33.3. This article mandates that all four wheels of the car stay within the white lines. While this isn't generally a difficult task on other circuits, turns 9 and 10 of the high-speed Red Bull Ring proved to be a substantial challenge for drivers due to their characteristics. Adding to the difficulty is the increased weight of modern F1 cars, a factor that the track design hasn't adapted to since its F1 debut. Spielberg has been part of the sport for over 2 decades, but back then the cars were significantly lighter, which allowed for easier cornering within the track's white lines. This regulation stirred controversy in 2021 as well, but this year the stewards have been particularly vigilant, penalizing many drivers for not respecting track limits. This has elicited widespread protest from F1 drivers and teams. Aston Martin has been the first team to formally lodge a protest with the FIA, accusing the governing body of inconsistent application of the rule and permitting half of the grid to escape penalty-free. Lando Norris of McLaren is one of the drivers cited in their complaints, as he finished less than 5 seconds ahead of Aston Martin's Fernando Alonso despite alleged track limit violations. Despite no change in the top 3 positions, with Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc and Sergio Perez taking the podium, the midfield saw a fair amount of reshuffling. Carlos Sainz initially 4th placed, Lewis Hamilton in 6th and Pierre Gasly finishing 9th all received 10-second penalties. As a result, Lando Norris and Fernando Alonso were promoted to 4th and 5th place respectively. Sainz was demoted to 6th, while Hamilton ended up behind his Mercedes teammate George Russell. Aston Martin's Lance Stroll advanced to 9th ahead of Gasly, earning the team 3 additional points. In the lower part of the classification table, penalties were also given to Alex Albon and Logan Sargent, and Esteban Ocon received a gigantic 30-second penalty, with Nick De Vries and Yuki Tsunoda managing to get out with minimal punishments. These events underscore why Aston Martin was particularly keen to ensure that the FIA undertook a thorough review of the numerous track limit infringements, because the enforcement of these penalties significantly impacts the championship standings and team strategic planning for future races. This saga brings to the table the long-standing debate around F1's track limits rule. Is it fundamentally flawed, or have the drivers simply been taking liberties with this corner for years, only to face the consequences now? I think that at the moment it seems more plausible that the latter is true. The drivers now understand the scrutiny they're under, and it is reasonable to expect they will adapt and adjust their driving accordingly in future races. The zero-tolerance rule was introduced to address criticisms about inconsistency in the application of rules and different guidelines for different tracks and corners. The goal was to have a uniform rule that could be applied at every corner of every track, and using the white line as the limit seemed to be a simple and clear-cut solution. Despite this, the Red Bull Ring's final corner is no longer policed with the exit curb as the natural limit, which would have actually discouraged drivers from going too wide, since they would lose time crossing the curb's edge. But setting aside the debate over whether the rule is right or wrong, the events in Austria reflect the full enforcement of the current rule in its full effect. The fact that there were a farcical number of offenses indicates the level of disregard the drivers had for the rule, and this highlights the need for the drivers to respect and adhere to the track limit. Regardless of the challenge of the track, which is clearly a big factor, I think that if they reran this race tomorrow, they wouldn't have nearly as many problems because drivers now know how close they're being watched. They can't take liberties like before, and blaming the track for encouraging it when you know these are the rules doesn't feel right. The consistent application of track limit rules by the FIA was commendable. However, the delay in issuing warnings and penalties was a significant problem, potentially affecting race outcomes and strategies. A better system to monitor and immediately penalize track limit violations is definitely needed, and implementing a system with sensors or cameras could help detect in real time if a car crosses the track limit. This sort of system is not beyond the technical and financial capabilities of F1, given that similar technology is already in use in other racing series, like MotoGP. If successfully implemented, such a system could alert the teams in real time, allowing them to immediately communicate with their drivers and adjust their strategies accordingly. The technology could function similarly to the current system used for other racing infractions, such as the deployment of safety cars or red flags. Having such a system in place would ensure immediate and most accurate penalty decisions, reducing the need for time-consuming post-race reviews. The only instances where manual review might still be necessary would be when a penalty decision is challenged due to extenuating circumstances like avoiding an accident. This would not only improve the consistency of penalty applications, but also enhance the transparency and fairness of the sport. The technological capabilities are there. It's now up to the regulatory bodies to implement such systems to enhance the overall integrity of the sport. A track change would simply not cut it because this track is not exclusive to F1 and its safety limits must be respected. So, F1 has to get its act together and stop bringing its own sport into disrepute. For example, one simple rule would be that all track limit penalties that help the driver gain lap time must be tallied and enforced before the flag falls. No time penalties are allowed after the result has been called. Once the FIA accepts those simple concepts as law, the teams will put the technology in place to measure sloppy driving and instantly tell the driver how wide they were. The real story here is how it was ever allowed to happen. The reason for that is the heaviest cars in single-seat racing are now too big for the tracks they used to thrive on. The drivers are now buried low with appalling sight lines to the turn-in points even on the best tracks. And the excess mass means that when they arrive at high-speed corners, microsecond errors in placement can lead to be meters offline. The next formula must address the driver's field of vision and excess mass. They need to be higher and forward enough to see the track at the speeds expected of the next cars. And if the ultimate grip is again limited by design, so must the weight. The time penalties hit Mercedes the hardest, and they were already having an uncharacteristically challenging weekend in Austria. This was evidenced by Hamilton starting from an unusually low P18 during the sprint qualifying session. Despite Hamilton and his teammate Russell making some progress through the grid during the race, it still marked one of the most underwhelming performances from the Silver Arrows in recent memory. Moreover, Hamilton's continuous complaints over the team radio about the car's condition potentially frustrated team principal Toto Wolff to the extent that he felt compelled to intervene over the radio, stating, "We know the car is bad, Lewis. Please just drive it." After earning a double podium finish in Barcelona and ranking among the top 3 in Montreal, it's puzzling to see a team like Mercedes experience such a steep decline in performance. Clearly, either Ferrari made significant improvements or the Austrian circuit just suits their setup better. However, according to the 7-time world champion, the problem was rooted in the car. Specifically, the front wing was the primary cause for his inability to keep the car within the track limits. Many F1 fans after the race, perhaps surprisingly, thought that the FIA did good and acted accordingly, and for once didn't side with the complaining drivers, and I'll have to agree. Leclerc and Alonso appeared to navigate the weekend without significant issues related to the track limits, and Verstappen, despite receiving a few warnings during qualifying, also adapted his driving to comply with the rules, resulting in him clinching pole position and winning the race by a significant margin. This suggests that while challenging, it is indeed possible to drive within the confines of the track limits at the Red Bull Ring. The grievances voiced by other drivers and teams might be viewed as excuses, especially given that some drivers were able to perform effectively without violating the track limits. However, the consistent complaints about this specific aspect of the race hint at a broader issue that could impact the sport's integrity and competitiveness, making it imperative for the FIA to respond positively and constructively. The sport thrives on competition, and any regulations that hinder that must be scrutinized and adjusted for the betterment of the competition. What do you think? Did the FIA act appropriately, or could they have done things differently? Let us know in the comments below, and we will see you in the next one.